Hello everyone. So I'll preface this video by saying that I'm going to get back to the classic fantasy in a bit. I've got a few things lined up. Mythago Wood, possibly Levondus as well, might include that in the same video. Blood in the Mist, Phantastes, George MacDonald, etc, etc. I've got quite a few to review. It's just that I read those quite a while ago, and they obviously take quite a while to get my head around, get back into it. I'm going to be discussing Brian Evenson or Evenson's fairly short book, 170 pages-ish, story, Last Days. Now this story is composed of two parts, a novella that came out in 2003 called The Brotherhood of Mutilation, and Last Days as well, which came out in 2009 or 6, I think it's 2009. So it's composed of two parts, and I'll say first of all that I really did not enjoy the second part, and a lot of people agree with me as well, just by reviews and stuff that I've read. Really intriguing, good first half, although I did have some problems with it as well. So I'll start off by saying that I was really gripped by the start. It's about a Brotherhood of Mutilation, as you might have imagined by the start of the title of the first part. The ethos of this the ethos of this Brotherhood is that they're trying to cut off their arms, and they're trying to cut off various limbs and legs and noses and other parts of their bodies in order to get closer to God. So you can just tell from that start that it's quite, it doesn't really take itself too seriously. It's a black comedy. It almost reminds me of a combination of In Bruges plus Fight Club, especially the second half, plus the film Martyrs as well, the horror film Martyrs. Quite apt actually. So I was very much intrigued by the start of this book. It's almost Kafkaesque in a way. It starts off very much like the trial, where Kay is taken away. Klein, the detective Klein, this hard-boiled detective, we very quickly realise that he's connected to this Brotherhood, in the sense that he's lost. I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers in this, because I'm trying to keep it quick. But he's lost an arm. He's lost a hand actually, in this confrontation with an old friend in this infiltration work that he's done. This big sort of climactic conflict, I suppose, and he's lost an arm. And the reason a hand, and the reason that's important is that in the papers, the Brotherhood seen in the papers that he self-cauterized his own stump after he cut it off, and that attracts the attention of the Brotherhood, because he didn't flinch. So that might give you a sense of why the sort of ethos and the mentality of this slightly unhinged Brotherhood. I'll say though that it's very funny. It's surprisingly funny from the start. It's not really a dark story. It doesn't take itself too seriously. There are two characters, for example, called Ramsey and Goose, that try to contact Klein. And from the start, he's sort of just flung into this world. He's driven to this compound. And some quite funny scenes, especially at the start, where there's very quick back and forth dialogue. So, for example, we had a little bit of conversation here. This is Klein driving, or Klein being taken to the compound, completely clueless. But this is what Ramsey and Goose has to say. But which is more of a shock? Asked Ramsey. A man losing his fingers or a man losing his hand? Klein didn't know if he was expected to answer. I'd like to get out of the car, he said. So there are 8s, said Ramsey, and then there are 8s. They came to a curve. Klein watched Ramsey post the other hand on the steering wheel for balance, turning the wheel with his cupped stump. Personally, I prefer a system of minor and major amputations, according to which I'd be a 2 out of 3. I prefer by weight, said Goose. Weigh the lopped off member, I say. But you see, said Ramsey, bled or unbled, and doesn't that give a certain advantage to the corpulent? You develop standards, says Goose, penalties and handicaps. Why do you need me? Asked Klein. Excuse me? Asked Ramsey. He wants to know why we need him, said Goose. That's easy, said Ramsey. A crime has been committed. Why me? Asked Klein. So I should say, you might get the sense there that a strong characteristic of this work is that the dialogue is very back and forth. It's actually almost all pages are just composed of dialogue. It's very direct, very active narrative. The dialogue is nothing I've ever really seen before. I read a review that it feels almost like they're talking not to each other but past each other in a way, which is somewhat comical, but it also gets a little bit grating after a while. It's just, you feel like they want to sort of connect a little bit more. So Klein is taken to this compound, and from there it gets quite interesting. I really enjoyed the background details of how this world is sort of composed. How Klein is just flung into this compound, and there are these guards with one eye, or just one eye. There's this second in command who is, I'll just say he's the main antagonist, called Borchert, French I believe, or Borchet. And Borchet wants Klein to, this is the main conceit of the story, he wants Klein to solve a mystery or a murder. And that's all I'll say really. So I do have some problems with that. I'll try to keep it fairly vague though. So Borchet wants Klein to solve this murder. However, the things that he asks Klein to do seems to be completely contradictory to the eventual goal. I'll just leave it at that. So there are some slightly confused plot elements, I suppose. So I'll say, if, just before we go on, I just forgot a quote actually from the very start. So there's a biblical quote at the very first start of part 1. It's from Matthew. It's a biblical quote. I'm not entirely sure. I'm just going a little bit of a mini rant here. I'm not entirely sure how typos get through, especially when it's on just one page. It's just a tiny biblical quote. So I'll read this out. It's very pertinent to the ethos of the Brotherhood of Mutilation. It's actually their sort of reasoning behind why they cut off their limbs. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut F off and cast it from thee. There's 2 F's there instead of 2 it's. I'm not entirely sure why that is in a printed edition of a professionally published book. And there's just skipping ahead a little bit. There's also quite an infuriating typo as well, where I'll just say that Borchet, the second in command of the compound, is said to have just one eye, and throughout the entire story he's said to have 2 eyes, and that's not just a recorrection, there's also details about his 2 eyes, so I feel there could have been stronger editing as well. So this book is a very gruesome book. It's lauded for that, and it's also despised for that, I suppose. It's cartoonish. The violence is definitely cartoonish. It's quite ridiculous actually, and unfortunately that has a sort of desensitizing effect. There'll be people with no hands, no arms, no legs, no eyelids, no lips, all sorts. It's just ridiculous. Even when I say it, it's just ridiculous. It's not meant to be taken. So, apart from the nonsensical plot, I should say, not the whole thing isn't nonsensical. The murder sort of mystery element to me is somewhat nonsensical and doesn't really add up with the sort of contradictory goals of the antagonist. I'll say that from the second part, once Klein has solved this mystery, and we're on to this next part of the journey, it does feel somewhat tacked on, and it feels like it could have been another book, and then so you could have developed part 1 and just ran with that and just been its own thing. And then there's part 2 where it somewhat feels connected but not. It's strange. So the second part is it's strange. It's repetitive in a way. It seems to go in cycles where Klein will be kidnapped. Then I was about to give a spoiler there, but he'll be kidnapped. Something will happen to him. He'll be kidnapped again. Something very similar will happen to him again. So there's hospitals. There's back at the compound. There's even I'll say this is not a spoiler. It's quite an interesting part of the book where Klein meets a group, another sort of subsect of the Brotherhood called the Pauls, and they're all named after the Apostle Paul. They all have blonde hair as well. I can't remember if I figured out the reason why they have blonde hair. I think it's just conformity. So there's some quite surreal and strange elements to this book. It all goes fairly quickly though, and it's not too bad. However, the second part really just ends up being a sort of action film, like an FPS game really. A lot of people said it just seems a completely wasted opportunity. It goes from a sort of intriguing entering this world where there are people with amputated limbs and they rate themselves, and there's a hierarchy based on they were sort of amputations. It goes from that to just all-out war, really. Just gratuitous violence, and it just seems it's too much. And again, unfortunately, Klein doesn't really change throughout all of this. He just seems to be a walking gun, essentially. Really unfortunate. It just seems a little bit almost juvenile in a way. There's a good point, somewhat a good point made at the end, but it really is quite ridiculous by the end. It's almost like Tarantino, actually. It's very much like Tarantino. So I think I'll end by giving some excerpts. It's not, I'd say, because it's so short, it's worth the read. It's definitely an intriguing idea, but I feel like it could have been done so much better editing, better handling of the plot. So there's some details that are just unexplained. For example, yes, nicely done, said Borchet, quite professional. But I thought you were a self-cauterizer. I was, said Klein. It was redone afterwards. What a shame, said Borchet, smiling thinly. Still, a good start nonetheless. He let go of Klein's hand, readjusted himself in his chair. You're welcome to sit down, he said. Unfortunately, I'm in the only chair. Do feel free to sit to help yourself to the floor. Klein looked about him, finally settling to the floor, posting his stump against it and bringing the rest of his body down. There, said Borchet. That's better now, isn't it? I suppose you're wondering why you're here. The investigation, said Klein. The investigation, said Borchet. That's right. You want the details? No, said Klein. No? I'm wondering how I can arrange to leave. Leave me, said Borchet. You find me offensive somehow. Leave this whole place. But why, Mr. Klein, said Borchet, smiling. This is paradise. Klein did not say anything. Borchet let his smile fade slowly, artificially. I was against bringing you, he said. I don't mind telling you. No outsiders has always been my policy, and no recruiting. But some of the others were unimpressed by the story of self-cauterization. Perhaps it's nothing more than a story, Mr. Klein. No, said Klein, it's true. But why, Mr. Klein? Surely you could easily have applied a tourniquet and called a doctor. Then I wouldn't have been able to kill the man who cut my hand off. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. I'd definitely say there's some faults to the book. It's a very short read though, and it's quite an intriguing sort of concept. Definitely not for the faint-hearted though. So, back to classic fantasy, I think, for the next review. So hopefully you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time. Cheers.